the transformation has taken place in the production sector, hasn't it? I mean, import exports, no, but in the production sector, services increased quite sharply. Agriculture's got down quite sharply. Industries more or less remained the same. Is that not right?
When we look at transformation, we are really looking at transformation across sectors, not within sector. By within sector, I mean what is happening with firms within the sector. So there are other researchers who have done good work focusing on firm level analysis. For example, Gonzalo at World Bank had a paper or a study. PIDE also has done a lot of work where they also look at directly, indirectly at firm level analysis, especially in sludge and what are the frictions which may be preventing. So agriculture share has definitely decreased. So for example, here by about 10 percentage point over this period. Now the sectors where the share has increased, because this 10% has to be accounted for some sectors. So I think those are trade somewhat. Another one is, I think, retail, construction a bit, and a bit in manufacturing. These are not very big changes. These are about 3 percentage point increase in employment share and so on.
Employment is not properly measured, Ahmed, because you see, the point is most of the people who migrate to the city and are working here or migrate overseas, they are treated as agricultural workers even now, because that's where their domicile is. But in terms of GDP shares, if you look, there's been quite a sharp transformation.
Let's focus on Pakistan. You see that the share of employment, the share of agriculture in total employment has fallen by about 10 percentage point. Has also fallen somewhat for government, but it has gone up mostly for trade, transport, construction, and a bit for manufacturing. Agriculture share has gone down, and the share for these sectors has gone up.
Welcome everybody to a PIDE webinar. As you all know, we do webinars very regularly to try and build a conversation on economics in Pakistan. It is our fervent desire that Pakistani academics would discuss each other's work. And we are probably the only organization that invites everybody to do webinars with us so that we can learn. I'm so sorry to see that other organizations don't follow suit. In fact, I had a conversation with some Pakistani academics in England, and they claim they're very exclusive. They only talk to their friends and nobody else. They only sit in a silo of agreement. When I asked them, why don't you come to a webinar? They said, no, we only listen to each other. We don't need to listen to anybody because all knowledge rests with Pakistanis who sit in England and who advocate for English universities and defend. But we are Pakistanis. We don't do that. We invite everybody to come and listen, to come and talk, and to come and present their work. So today we've invited Ahmed Jamal Pirzada, young academic who's doing very well in England, who's got a senior lecture in economics at the University of Bristol, and is quite active on Pakistani sort of research scene. He has developed a new paper along with some colleagues. He'll tell you about them. It's called Pakistan and the Rest, Tale of Productivity. There's a tale of dismal productivity growth, misallocation, and missing transformation. So with that introduction, let me tell Ahmed to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always an honor to be at PIDE and present the work and share their feedback as well. Always an honor to be with Dr. Nadeem as well. We go back a long time. I consider him as a mentor, also as a father, if I have a freedom to say that on an academic forum, but nonetheless. So let me share my screen. So this is the paper. This is a joint work with Adil Nakhuda, who's at IBA, with Sehan. Currently IMF, but this work was done when he was mostly with EAG and Sara Javed. So the earlier version of this paper was published as a report by EAG together with FNF. And that is a bit more targeted at the audience, which is not so much academically oriented, and it gives a lot of repetition to explain things in a relatively more simpler manner. The version which I'm presenting today is is tuned to a bit more academically targeted audience, and you'll see a bit of model and theory there to sense a bit of a motivation for why what we do is relevant. So with that, let me begin. So this is the structure of the presentation, but let me give you a story, right? So what is the story we are trying to tell? The story we are trying to tell is we are looking at the structure of the economy. I'll explain what that means. And we are trying to ask how that has changed over the last 30 years. Most importantly, from 1990 to all the way up to 2018. Uh, Once we look at that, we actually see that the structure of the economy has changed, but not by as much as our peer economies. And then the next question we want to ask is why is that happening? When we look at the theory, we come up with several factors which could be the potential reason for why an economy may or may not transform, one of them being productivity, and the other one being misallocation or frictions in the economy or government policies which prevent resources from reallocating or moving from less productive to more productive sectors and therefore leading to transformation. Once we have these factors, we further dig into them and then we ask, okay, fine. So given labor productivity, what exactly are the driving factors of the labor productivity? And there we actually find that capital shallowing apparently is a lot more important than some of the other factors which are normally discussed. When it comes to misallocation or when it comes to friction, the government policies which prevent the efficient allocation of resources, ironically, what we find is when you focus at the broader economy with multiple sectors, you see that maybe it's not that bad. But when you restrict your attention to agriculture and non-agriculture, there you actually see that the misallocation stands out quite a bit. We find that there's definitely an over allocation of resources in agriculture sector vis-a-vis the non-agriculture sector. We don't get too much into the policies that may be leading to that, but then for there, I think PIDE has already done a very good work and with multiple publications on agricultural markets and regulations which may be relevant for that purpose. So I'll point the reader in that direction, especially the publications by Rasta in more recent times. Let me also say what this paper is not about. When we look at transformation, we are really looking at transformation across sectors, not within sector. By within sector, I mean what is happening with firms within the sector. So there are other researchers who have done good work focusing on firm level analysis. For example, Gonzalo at World Bank had a paper or a study focusing on firm level analysis. Waqar Vadhu has a series of paper. He's at LSE in Pakistan, Lahore. So they focus on firm level analysis. I think PIDE also has done a lot of work where they also look at directly, indirectly at firm level analysis, especially in sludge and what are the frictions which may be preventing resources at the firm level, at the micro level. The other thing which we don't do too much is we don't get into micro level policies which are relevant or which may be relevant for the policymaker, but we do provide a broader framework in terms of what are the broader reasons which may be preventing transformation to happen. So these are the two things which we don't do. So that's also important to keep in mind. So everyone knows where we are, what we answer and what we don't answer going forward in the presentation. Okay, so let's start with documenting this phenomena, which we dub as missing transformation. But first look at how this is defined. So in the literature, this is not a new literature. This goes way back. These papers are rather new, but this literature goes a lot back in the past. And this is actually defined as the movement of labor away from the agriculture sector. So as economies develop, you actually see that the share of labor working in the agriculture sector decreases along the developmental path. And you also see that this is true both for labor and also for the value added production in agriculture or the share of agriculture in the GDP, if you want to call it that. Now, if you only stop here, you might say, well, then what's the point? If structural transformation is a result of economic development, then why do we have to think about structural transformation at all? Because it will happen along the way in any case. So you are kind of just bringing it up for the sake of it. It's true by definition. But that's not the full story. There are also recent papers which actually look at frictions and government policies and other factors which actually prevent the structural transformation from happening. And they go on to argue, for example, this recent paper by Dort and Rustica, which goes on to say that it's not just that the economic development leads to structural transformation, but structural transformation can itself lead to development or economic transfer? Can it itself lead to development through an increase or an improvement in productivity in the economy, across the economy? So it's important not just that development leads to transformation, but also transformation leads to development through increased productivity and better allocation. So both are important to understand the story. So this is a screenshot I've taken from a paper, a handbook chapter, which was published in 2015, I guess. And this is just to illustrate the transformation which I'm talking about. This is mostly for developed economies who have already completed their development cycle. And you can see over here, as these economies tend to grow, on the x-axis, what you have is log of GDP per capita. So as you move from left to right, these countries are developing. On the y-axis, you have the share in total employment. That's the left-hand panel. On the right-hand panel, on the y-axis, what you have is the share in the value added. Okay? And you see over here, both in the case of value added and employment, as countries develop, the share of agriculture in both employment and value added decreases, and it's quite a persistent decline. For manufacturing, you see it increases, but after a certain point, it starts decreasing. So it's a bit of a hump-shaped relationship. For services, it's almost the inverse of what we see for agriculture. As countries develop, the share of agriculture increases. Now let's come to Pakistan. So this is the chart which looks at how the share of agriculture in total employment has changed for Pakistan. What you have on the x-axis is the employment share back in 1990, and what you have on the y-axis is how the share has changed over the 30-year period. And you actually see, if you this and the red line over here is the average for the countries in our sample. And you can see over here that for Pakistan, the share of agriculture has decreased by about 10 percentage point over this 30-year period. But this drop is actually almost half of what we see for other countries with similar initial conditions. Right? For most of the countries here, which are between 40 to 60% of the share in 1990, you see that the drop is almost twice as much, meaning minus about 20 percentage point. And for some of the other countries, the drop is even bigger. So from that perspective, you can see that yes, the economy has transformed to an extent, but it is much less than what we see for the peer economies. Now, we don't really get too much into this, but this is also useful because it looks at a more micro level data from the trade perspective. So here, what we do is we use this trade data set, which has information at 3-digit level in terms of both exports and imports between countries. And you can see over here, what you have on the x-axis is the percentage of export of all the items in the data set here, which I think we don't include services here because the data doesn't go too far back. So we have agriculture and manufacturing, and they together make up around 150 or 154 items in the data set. So there's a lot more information here, both at the sector level and within the sector level. What you have on the x-axis is the share of these items back in the export basket back in 1994, and on the y-axis what you have is the share of these items in the export basket in 2018. And this is the moving average in order to iron out any one-off fluctuation due to business cycle or shocks and stuff. The green diamonds over here, they show you the item. These highlight the items where the share has changed by more than 2 percentage point. And you can see over here, there are only about 6 or 5 items over here where the share in the export basket has changed by more than 2 percentage point. For all the other items, which make up about 150 or so, the share in the export basket has not changed by much at all. Okay? And which are these items? You actually see the textile fiber, which is relatively more value added, its share in the export basket, if anything, has decreased over this time period. Made up textile articles, they are relatively less value added in terms of or vis-a-vis textile fibers. Their share has increased relative to 1994 or 1990s. The other items over here, you have grain products, their share has increased somewhat, carpets, and there's probably cotton there, their share has decreased somewhat. But there's nothing interesting happening here. Apart from 5 items in the total of 150 or so, the share in the export basket over the 30-year period has not changed by much. What about imports? You see a similar kind of a story here. Most of the items, about 150 or 148, are very much on this red line, which says that their share in the import basket has not changed by much at all. There are few items whose share has actually increased or decreased. These are the items which have seen a decrease in their share in the import basket. You see that the share of machinery for textile apparels has actually decreased, for motor vehicles has decreased, aircraft and spacecraft has decreased. I don't know whether you want to see this as a good thing or a bad thing, but nonetheless, that's what we have. For petroleum products and energy-based products, the share in the import basket has increased. So nothing fundamental changing, which will suggest that there's a major change going on in Pakistan's production structure over this time period. Whether you look at the share or the agri share, which is the structural transformation definition, or you get to the micro data and you look at the composition of the export or the import basket. So overall, the story which we have over here is Pakistan, if anything, has seen very limited transformation over this 30-year period, especially when you compare this with the peer economies with similar levels of, with similar initial conditions going back to 1990. Okay, so the next question we want to ask
Ahmed,
is,
Ahmed,
yeah,
just one second. Let me
yes,
ask you.
please.
I mean, the transformation has taken place in the production sector, hasn't it? I mean, import exports, no, but in the production sector, services increased quite sharply.
Hmm.
Agriculture's got down quite sharply. Industries more or less remained the same. Is that not right?
So this is what so agriculture share has definitely decreased. So for example, here by about 10 percentage point over this period. Now, the sectors where the share has increased, because this 10% has to be accounted for some sectors. So I think those are trade somewhat. Another one is, I think, retail, construction a bit, and a bit in
Agriculture,
manufacturing. These are
sorry,
not very big changes. These are about 3 percentage point increase in
sorry,
employment share and so on.
sorry, Ahmed. Agriculture has decreased by 10%. I don't believe that. Agriculture has gone down quite sharply, 20% according to this chart, isn't it?
This is employment share, unless you are thinking, but no, but
No,
this is also,
I'm thinking of GDP shares.
even for the
GDP
GDP,
shares,
actually, the share
agriculture.
has gone down by 7 percentage point or so, between 7 or 8 percentage point between 1990 to 2018. And this is the economic transformation data set, which has data for 50 or so or 56 developing countries. Um, and that's
I don't
what
think
we
that's
have there.
correct. You have to look at the Pakistani. If you look at the economic survey, if I
Hmm.
remember right, I haven't seen it in a long time. The share of services, if I remember right, is up to 60% now, and agriculture is down to about 20%.
No,
And
in GDP, I'm not sure. In employment, the share at the moment in 2023 or so, I think it's about 38% or so in employment.
employment is slightly employment is
Higher.
not. We can talk about it. Employment is not properly measured, Ahmed, because you see the point is most of the people who migrate to the city and are working here or
Hmm.
migrate overseas, they are treated as agricultural workers even now
Hmm.
because that's where their domicile is. But
Yeah.
in terms
Hmm.
of GDP shares, if you look, there's been quite a sharp transformation.
I'm not sure, to be honest, because so maybe we can look at the data again, or maybe I can look at another source of data and then see maybe there's an issue with the data set which we are using here. That could very well be the case.
Sure, go ahead.
But that's something for us to dig further. But from this data set, at least, both whether you look at value added or you look at employment share, there's not much of a change, contrary to what one believes. But we should definitely look at perhaps some of the other data sets. Initially, nothing comes to my mind which so shows a very big change, but then let me look at that in a bit more detail going forward. But point noted to double check this. Okay, so the next question is, so to understand why there is a limited transformation over this time period, whether it's employment or value added, we need to ask what drives transformation. Okay. So for this, we need to go back to this paper. It's a rather simple paper which puts together a model of structural transformation. Depending on the audience, I have the maths here. So people who do want to look at this and see what this is all about, but people who don't really have an academic background, I'll probably skip. But the key channel or the mechanism over here is this. So you have three sectors, and importantly, what you allow for what we call as non-homothetic preferences. Essentially, the idea is you want to model a household for which the income elasticity is less than one for agriculture, it's about one for manufacturing, and it's greater than one for services. And all these equations over here, which you see, they are essentially coming out of that, right? They're actually capturing the idea, or they are modeling a household for the households for whom income elasticity is less than 1 for agri, equal to 1 for manufacturing, and about greater than 1 for services. That's all what's happening over here. On the firm side, firms maximize profits. We assume a very simple framework, perfect competition, perfect markets. Everything is very, very simple neoclassical. AI over here is the productivity parameter. YI is how much output is produced by each sector. LI is how much labor is employed by each sector. AI, as I said before, is the productivity parameter. I stands for the three sectors being agriculture, which is A, M, which is manufacturing, S, which is services. Agriculture in this simple framework, the productivity parameter over here, AI, also is similar to labor productivity because there's no capital in the simple framework in their paper. So AI is productivity, or TFP is the same as labor productivity. Later, we'll add capital when we do the decomposition, but for now, for motivation, this is what you have. So you solve the model, and this is what you end up getting. The key equation which I want to focus on is this one there. This is essentially the share of labor in agriculture. And what does it tell us? It actually tells us that the share of labor in agriculture is an inverse function of productivity in the agriculture sector and also productivity in the services sector. So as productivity increases in any of these sectors, the share of labor working in agriculture is going to go down. What's the reason for that? The reason goes back to what we assumed, the kind of preferences which we assumed over here, right? Which is essentially the non-homothetic preferences. As productivity increases, two things happen. One is obviously prices decrease for the goods produced in that sector. That will cause households to consume more of that good. So if households are consuming more of that good, you might think, well, the labor supply or the labor engaged in that sector should actually go up. But there's another thing which is happening, which is an increase in productivity leads to an increase in wages, meaning income. And as income increases, because of this assumption of non-homothetic preferences, households demand a lot more of services and relatively less of agriculture. Their demand for all three items, services, agriculture, manufacturing, goes up, but it goes up by disproportionately more for services than it does for agriculture. And this disproportionate increase in demand for the services is actually what is then driving the transformation process. Yeah. So this is the intuition or the mechanism behind why an increase in productivity leads to, irrespective of whether that's in agriculture sector or in the non-agriculture sector, why is it that that leads to a decrease in the share of labor working in the agriculture sector? So that's the mechanism. But the key story over here is that an improvement in productivity, whether that's agriculture or the overall in the economy, is important for transformation in the simple framework with no frictions, perfectly competitive markets, and so on and so forth. We'll look at the misallocation story later, where we do have to consider imperfect markets and so on and so forth. So let's jump on to the data and see what is happening with productivity for Pakistan. This is where we are plotting how productivity has changed in Pakistan and other South Asian economies between 1990 to 2018. And you see Pakistan is at the bottom of the spectrum. Right? What does this mean? This essentially means this is equivalent to an annual increase in labor productivity of 1.33%. So that's pretty low. And this is not just the overall economy itself, it's also true for the agriculture sector as well. Agriculture is not performing any better, it's actually slightly worse. And this is actually a consistent pattern. We always see that the increase in productivity is always less than in the rest of the economy for most of these countries, for almost all of these countries here and most of the countries elsewhere. So here's what we have over here then. That the increase in productivity is pretty dismal, right? For Pakistan, and given the transformation process of the model which we have looked at and what it tells us about the transformation process itself, it's not too hard to figure out why there's so less transformation going on in Pakistan vis-a-vis some of the other economies which we have seen before. This is the same kind of plot, but it sort of plots all the 50 or so countries in the data set rather than just the South Asian economies. This one is the aggregate productivity, labor productivity, and this is only for the agriculture sector. And you see Pakistan is very much in the bottom quantile of the distribution, irrespective of whether you look at the overall economy or you look at the agriculture sector alone. Yeah. So again, quite a bad story, whether you look at South Asia or whether you look at the full set of developing economies. Not the full set, but then a lot of the developing economies in the sample. So what is the implication over here? So the implication, as I've said, is this. Because of the dismal increase in labor productivity, there's very little reason for resources to move from agriculture to non-agriculture sector. Pakistan is falling behind not only in the region, but also amongst the rest of the developing world. But this is not the end of the story. Decomposing, remember, so when the incentive for resources to move from one sector to another also depends very much on the improvement in productivity in the other sector, how that pulls resources away from sector A, right? If productivity increases, wages are going to go up in that sector, and that will pull resources away from the other sectors towards itself, right? So it's really the within sector improvement in productivity which matters if you are to think about how transformation is going to play around in a multi-sector model. So, and when you do that, when you decompose labor productivity, here we are just looking at the aggregate or just for the agriculture sector. When you go further and decompose labor productivity into within sector improvements, you actually find that the performance is actually not just dismal, is rather depressing. Right? And this is what we do next. So we decompose labor productivity or aggregate labor productivity into improvements due to within sector improvements and due to reallocation itself. So let me just explain a bit more about this. Let me say what I'm saying. So aggregate labor productivity can increase due to two broad factors. One, again, I'm repeating myself a bit, but it's probably useful. One, you become better at doing things at the sector level, right? Labor productivity improves at the sector level, right? That's one source of improvement in aggregate labor productivity. The other one is simply the reallocation. We are not getting better at all at the sector level. The production processes and the structures or the environment is still exactly the same, but you just reshuffle resources by moving them from less productive to more productive sectors. And that reshuffling leads to an improvement in aggregate productivity. Okay? So there are these two sources, the within sector source, which is at the sector level, and the reallocation effect. And both of these lead to an increase in labor productivity at the aggregate level in the economy. Okay? And this is, we follow these guys over here in decomposing labor productivity into these two forces, which I've just described, the within sector effect and also the reallocation effect. Reallocation effect can be further broken down into the static effect and the dynamic effect. So the static effect is as simple is what I just said before, meaning resources move from less productive to more productive sectors. If that happens, static effect will be positive. And then there's the dynamic effect. And the dynamic effect is not looking at resources moving from less productive to more productive sectors. It's looking at the growth. It's looking at sectors moving from low growth sectors to high growth sectors, right? So if they move from low growth to high growth sectors, dynamic effect will be positive. If they move from high growth to low growth sectors, dynamic effect will be negative. Okay, so this is the overall decomposition which we look at now in the data. So there's the within effect, there's the reallocation effect, and in the reallocation effect, we have further decomposition into static and the dynamic effects. So let's look at this for Pakistan. So this is breaking down the aggregate labor productivity growth across the South Asian economies into the within effect and the net reallocation effect. This is not a surprise that you see that the increase in productivity growth or labor productivity growth for Pakistan is pretty bad. We have already seen that before. But what is important to note is when you only focus on the within sector improvements, what pulls resources away from other sectors towards itself, when you only look at within sector improvements, the improvement in productivity growth is only about 24% over this 30-year period. And that is equivalent to an average annual growth of about, I think, 0.79%. So within sector improvements, you're becoming better at doing things. So that has increased at an annual rate of only 0.79% over this 30-year period. Right? Which is pretty depressing. If you just focus on aggregate labor productivity, the number is 1.33, which is again pretty bad. But when you just focus on within sectors, within effect, it falls by about a half, and it falls to 0.79%, and it becomes a lot more depressing. The net reallocation effect is positive, which is, at the face of it, it's a good news that whatever reallocation, limited or so, has happened in a way which is growth enhancing, meaning resources on average have moved from less productive to more productive sectors. It's not that high, it's still pretty low. This is, I think, about 0.52, or the number comes somewhere around there on average. Pretty low, but nonetheless, you can say, well, okay, fine, whatever happened, it had a positive effect on the overall growth rate. So it was desirable nonetheless. For everyone else, you can actually see that the numbers are much higher, both for the within effect and the reallocation effect. But this comfort in the reallocation effect being positive, this comfort is a bit superficial, right? Because if you break this down into further static effect and the dynamic effect, you get a very, very different story. You get this. Now here, so note over here, for the net reallocation effect, it's positive for all the South Asian economies. So when resources move from one sector to the other, it was growth enhancing for all the economies. More so for other South Asian economies than Pakistan, but nonetheless positive. Okay? So if you only stop here, you will say, well, fair enough. All the countries are somewhat similar. The only difference is in the scale, right? There's no qualitative difference, it's a quantitative difference. But that's actually not true. When you decompose the net reallocation effect into static and dynamic effects, things start looking different, even within the South Asian economies. Let's get rid of the easier one first, the static effect. The static effect is positive for all South Asian economies, more so for some and less so for others, but nonetheless positive. What does this mean? That whatever reallocation has happened, it has happened from less productive to more productive sectors. Fair enough. But where these countries differ is the dynamic effect. The dynamic effect you can actually see is negative for Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and it's positive for India, Myanmar, and China. What's happening here? What's happening is, to understand the negative dynamic effect, yes, resources or labor is moving from less productive to more productive sectors, which is why the static effect is positive. But those sectors which happen to have a high labor productivity in terms of level, they happen to have a low productivity growth rate. So yes, labor is moving from low productive to high productive sectors, but at the same time, it's such that it's moving from high growth to low growth sectors. And essentially what that is, an easier way to think about that intuitively is that labor is moving from low productive to high productive sectors, but mostly it's moving to informal sectors, which happen to have a higher labor productivity because they are urban or whatever, but these happen to have a very low growth rate because most of them happen to be either non-tradable or informal manufacturing and so on and so forth. Right? So this is the data for Pakistan, all the countries with negative reallocation effect, negative dynamic effect. So let's only look at Pakistan to see what's happening over here. So you see over here that the employment, okay, let me say what this is. On the x-axis, you have the percentage points. On the left panel over here is the change in the employment share. And you have all the 4 countries over here, and then the industries within those countries or sectors within those countries. So you see how employment has changed for all these sectors over the time period for each of the country. And then you see the same for labor productivity. So here, let's focus on Pakistan. You see that the share of employment, the share of agriculture in total employment has fallen by about 10 percentage point. Has also fallen somewhat for government. But it has gone up mostly for trade, transport, construction, and a bit for manufacturing. So agriculture share has gone up, and the share of trade, transport, construction, and a bit of manufacturing has gone up. Agriculture share has gone down, and the share for these sectors has gone up. So let's now, and these sectors also happen to have high labor productivity, which is why static reallocation effect is positive. But what is happening with the growth rate of labor productivity in these sectors? So this is where you see that. So for 3 of these sectors, trade, transport, construction, productivity growth rate has either been 0 or somewhat negative. For manufacturing, the productivity growth rate is positive. So out of the 4 sectors where the labor share has increased, 3 of them are the ones where the productivity growth is either zero or slightly or somewhat negative. And this is the reason why the dynamic effect is negative for Pakistan, even when the static effect is positive. And this is consequential. Why? Because if your resources are moving from low productive to high productive sectors, yes, you will get a one-off jump in your productivity and therefore growth and development. But that may not sustain. Why? Because the growth rate in those sectors is low or negative. So it's a one-off gain. So such a reallocation with a positive static effect and a negative dynamic effect, it gives you a one-off improvement, but then it dies out. There's no subsequent improvement in terms of labor productivity and so on and so forth, because these are the sectors which are not doing very well in terms of improvements or growth. And that's actually concerning, right? And then we don't really get into this, but it's an interesting area to explore further for researchers. Why is it that the reallocation for Pakistan and some of these other economies is so different than the reallocation we see in India and China and Myanmar and also some of the other economies in East Asia and so on, right? So this is worth exploring. We don't explore it here, but this is an open question. What are the factors which lead transformation or the reallocation to even be qualitatively different across these economies, with the dynamic effect being negative or positive? And this is actually quite similar. There's a paper by Roderick which goes on to show that the dynamic effect for African economies is actually negative. So we are sort of similar to what we see in Africa and Latin America as well. For East Asian economies, dynamic effect is close to zero or in some cases positive, just to give you a context. Okay, so what is the takeaway? The takeaway from the decomposition exercise is that the positive static reallocation effects suggest that labor has indeed moved from less productive to more productive sectors for all South Asian economies. However, there are important qualitative differences as well when you consider the dynamic reallocation effect. The negative dynamic reallocation effect suggests that labor has moved from sectors exhibiting low growth in labor productivity. And this is concerning because this implies that this reallocation may not be growth enhancing, if not growth reducing, going into the future. So the policymakers should probably think about this a bit more, or should be concerned, if at all. Okay, so that's the decomposition story. So we actually see, apart from the reallocation effect or the negative dynamic reallocation effect, and why that may be important from policy point of view, the key takeaway is that within sector improvements are pretty low. The growth rate in within sector due to within sector improvements is very low. It's 0.79% on an annual basis. Okay, which further reendorses the first argument that labor productivity has improved by very little, thus providing very little incentive for resources to move from one sector to the other sector. And adding to the concern, whatever reallocation has happened, that is also somewhat concerning because it's only beneficial. It only gives us a one-shot gain, not a persistent gain in performance going into the future. Okay, so now let's kind of come back a bit and say, or go a bit more further into the details and say, we have looked at the labor productivity growth. We have decomposed it. We have seen how labor productivity is improving due to within sector changes and due to reallocation. Now we want to ask, what is driving this within sector change? Whatever growth has happened or has not happened, what is the reason for that? So for that, we turn to this simple growth accounting exercise. So we follow the framework which is presented in Jones' 2016, I think, handbook chapter on economic growth. So we have labor productivity here on the left-hand side. And this allows us to break down labor productivity at the aggregate level into 3 components. The first one is you can call it the physical capital component. It's essentially capital output ratio. The second component is the human capital per worker. And the third component is what we normally refer to as TFP. Mostly when we talk about productivity, many people have TFP in mind. So that's set. So these are the 3 components which determine labor productivity in this rather simple framework. And what we want to do is we want to look at each of these components and see which one of these may be more important for understanding the dismal or the depressing growth in labor productivity we have seen for Pakistan over the last 30 or so years. So this is the first chart. The graph to the left actually plots the average TFP growth for about 180 or so countries in the data set. This data is coming from the Penworld tables. Actually, both the data sets, all the data over here is coming from the Penworld tables. So, and all of this is for about 180 or so countries which are available there. The first chart actually shows you, the x-axis shows you the level of development, the labor productivity for each of these countries as of 2018. And the y-axis shows you, for the first chart, it shows you the average annual TFP growth rate over this time period, over the 30-year period for all the countries in the sample. So let's look at the first chart over here. So average labor productivity or average annual TFP growth in Pakistan between this time period is around 1.19 or so. This is actually not too different from, there's a study by PIDE, I think it's done by, is it Usama Siddiqui, I guess, if I'm not getting the name wrong. So the number is somewhat similar to what is reported there as well. And similar to what is reported there, this is not too different from what we see for other economies as well. For India, the number is slightly higher, but still less than 2. It's about 1.79 or so. For Bangladesh, it's a bit lower, but I won't really bet my life on that. It's rather these numbers for developed and developing economies, or let's say fast-growing economies and the already developed economies, these numbers are not very different. So it doesn't look like that TFP growth in Pakistan is very different from what we see for other fast-growing economies. Now that's the takeaway I want you to have from here. Yes, there are some economies where the TFP growth rate has been much higher and others where the TFP growth rate has been much lower, but there's no consistent pattern which shows you that it is always higher for fast-growing economies and always lower for low growth economies. Right? There's no pattern of that sort which we see here. India over here is about 1.7. There's another there's a more recent study which is a bit more detailed, which is based on these CLEMS data for India, which came out in 2018, I think, by Gupta and co-authors. They actually find the TFP growth rate in India to be even lower than the 1.79 in the Penworld's table. I think they find it to be around 1.2 or 2.4 or something like that. So whichever way you cut it, the TFP growth rate for fast-growing economies like India, China, and so on doesn't always stand out to be very high to an extent that we say that this is where Pakistan is really falling behind. But this is the chart to the left is actually where Pakistan is indeed falling behind. So this is capital to output ratio as of 2018. Again, on the x-axis, you have the level of labor productivity. You can change this with the GDP per capita, nothing changes. And you can see that the capital to output ratio is almost one of the lowest in the case of Pakistan. For India and Bangladesh, it's about close to 4% or so. For Pakistan, it's less than 2. Less than 2. It's a ratio. It's not percent. So it's less than 2. And worse, we got here. We are here not just because we've always been here. This ratio has been declining since late 70s in the case of Pakistan. For India, this ratio, capital to output ratio, has been somewhat stable around 4 during this period. For China and Bangladesh, this ratio has increased by a huge amount over this period. But for Pakistan, contrary to everyone else, this ratio has been declining and is now at about 1.75 or 7 or so. On human capital, the trend is similar. It has increased or improved in the case of Pakistan as well. I mean, I don't want to read too much into the kink over here. So I'll probably just think about this as a trend line, so to speak. So yes, we are doing worse than what we see for the other economies over here. But there is a trend increase nonetheless. In the case of capital output ratio, there's a completely different trend to what we see for the other economies. This is a decomposition we do. We ask how much of the variation in labor productivity can be explained by the inputs. Now, there are studies by Inkler and so on and so forth. They go on to show that on average, inputs go on to explain about 1/3 of the variation in labor productivity for developing economies. So this is already documented. So here we have some economies as a reference point. We have Pakistan. This column over here shows you what is the percentage of variation in your labor productivity, which is explained by the inputs being both capital output ratio or capital and human, both physical and human capital, right? So this is the index, which I'm calling as the input index here. And you can see over here that the input index or the variation in inputs only explains about 6% of variation in labor productivity in the case of Pakistan. This number actually is very similar to the US, but US makes sense because US has already grown, has sort of already converged to the new steady state, and inputs now play a much smaller role, and TFP growth plays a much bigger role in the case of developed economies, as we know from the growth theory. Right? But for most of these other economies, the developing economies, which are arguably further away from the steady state, you see that the share of inputs tends to be much, much higher. Right? In some of the cases, actually, all of the variation in labor productivity is actually explained by the variation in inputs. So, inputs for developing economies tend to be a lot more important or tend to contribute a lot more to the improvement in their labor productivity or the variation in their labor productivity. Unlike what we see in the case of Pakistan, right? Where it's the exact opposite. So either you can say we've already converged to our steady state and that's what it is, or you can say there's something which is preventing us from converging to our steady state, and therefore inputs are not being accumulated at a rate which is desirable or which these should, if we allow or if we somehow get rid of those frictions. But that's the important takeaway. Graphically, this is what it looks like. So here I'm plotting again GDP growth rate, sorry, labor productivity, the growth rate of that. And what else do I have? I have TFP growth, right? So blue line is the TFP growth. The red magenta line is the labor productivity growth. And you see they almost overlap each other, which is essentially capturing the same idea which I'm trying to get across here, which is almost all of the variation in your labor productivity growth is explained by the TFP growth, right? Inputs don't really play an important role, unlike what we see for other developing economies. Just as a passing remark, actually, Egypt also happens to have a very low capital to output ratio, almost similar to what we see for Pakistan. All other economies tend to have a much higher capital to output ratio. I haven't seen the trend for Egypt, so I don't know what has been happening there, but they appear to be similar to what we have here. Okay, so what does it mean? What is the implication? So in the context of Pakistan, improving labor productivity growth requires policies which will reverse the decreasing trend in capital output ratio. That's an important point we want to get across. We don't really get into understanding why capital to output ratio is decreasing or behaving the way it's decreasing. But in another write-up, I won't call it a paper, in another write-up, I argue that the macro uncertainty may be an important reason behind this trend. And in that write-up, I actually compare the Sharpe ratio on a 5-year index fund based on the PSX, the stock market. 5-year index fund, because that will help you capture returns over a business cycle frequency rather than a very short-term or a very long-term frequency. So if you look at the returns on an index fund, which are the returns on your stock market over a 5-year period, you actually find that the Sharpe ratio for Pakistan ends up being much lower than what you find it to be for India. What does that tell you? That tells you that the return for every unit of risk you take is lower in Pakistan than it is in India. So in this write-up, again, I won't say that this is very robust. It's a very simple off-the-shelf kind of an exercise. So here I kind of argue that macro uncertainty may be an important reason for why for explaining, maybe one of the very important reasons for explaining that the trend which we see in capital output ratio. There's another study which is in a different context. So these guys, they actually look at farm investment in Ghana. And they actually also find that providing insurance products which reduce the risk for the farmer against climate shocks or price fluctuations actually increases farm level investment by the farmers. So this is more of an RCT kind of study. So you have to be a bit more careful when kind of extrapolating it at the general equilibrium level. But nonetheless, they again at the RCT at a micro level, they show a link between risk and investment in a developing country context, in the context of farm investment. But there may be many other reasons as well which are contributing to this. Again, PIDE has done a lot of work on identifying frictions which prevent firms from investing more, or even firms to corporatize or register themselves or enter the formal sector, and so on and so forth. So there may be many other micro reasons, but here I want to highlight this one macro reason, which I think is also important for understanding the phenomenon. Okay. So almost the last section of what I want to say. So far, here's the story. So there's limited transformation. It's the reason for that is limited growth in labor productivity, both due to within sector improvement and also due to reallocation. The limited improvement or the dismal increase in labor productivity, as per our analysis, is driven by the declining trend in capital output ratio, which happens to be very different for Pakistan than what we see for other emerging economies, where inputs play a very important role. But in the case of Pakistan, we see capital inputs don't play an important role, and all of the increase is simply driven by the TFP growth. But TFP itself, we don't see that this is very different, or TFP growth happens to be very different from what we see for other fast-growing economies. So it's not really the deciding factor. So the deciding factor really is capital accumulation. We don't get too much into understanding what are the factors behind that, except suggesting that macro uncertainty may be an important one, but micro factors may also be very important. But we don't have much to say for that, and then we refer the reader to the work which has been done by other researchers in Pakistan on this topic. So coming back, so within sector, fine. What about the reallocation thing? Yes, reallocation effect has been smaller, but is it smaller just because there's no reason for the reallocation to happen? Or is it smaller because there's something preventing the reallocation from happening? Okay, so that's the question now. So now we are moving away from the perfect equilibrium or the perfect competitive, fully mobile markets and so on and so forth, to asking, is there a reason for, is there something which is preventing resources from moving from one sector to the other? Going beyond the simple reason, which is the productivity or the dismal increase in productivity within sectors. So this is what we want to look at now. So again, we need to kind of motivate this with some theory to before we jump onto the data. So again, it's sort of very simple. This is a multi-sector model. That's why you have I appearing everywhere. So you have a co-abductor's production function. You can work out an expression for labor productivity. It depends, labor productivity in sector I, this one here, depends on your technology parameter. I think this is the share of capital in production and the wage rate. This is the equation which you end up getting as long as you assume perfect competition. This is what you'll have. This expression here is labor productivity. So under perfect competition, labor productivity is simply a function of this. It depends on the technology parameter and it depends on the wage rate in the sector. Now, if you go a bit further and you assume that labor is perfectly mobile, and you also assume that production technology is similar across sectors, then you end up with this equation here. Now, all the i's have disappeared on the right-hand side, meaning under these three assumptions here, perfect competition, perfect labor mobility, similar production technology, labor productivity should be exactly similar across all the sectors. Okay, so that's the result from this multi-sector model under these assumptions. Okay. Now what we are going to do is we are going to look at the data and see whether this is indeed the case. And then we are going to step back and say, if this is not the case, which of these assumptions are probably violated such that we see labor productivity to be very different across sectors in the data. And then that will give us a sense of, is it labor mobility, which is the reason for differences in labor productivity? Is it differences in production technology? Is it something else? For example, government regulations or market failures? We don't break that down, to be honest, but we actually do enough to point out whether that is an important reason or not, or could be an important reason or not. Okay, so that's the framework. So under these assumptions, labor productivity should be exactly similar across all the sectors. So this is the data on labor productivity. So we write it in the form of gaps. You can look at the paper, why or how we do that, but it doesn't really matter much for the story. So this is what we have for labor productivity relative to the overall labor productivity in the economy for all the sectors which we have in the data set. The first thing that stands out, we don't include, we have government here. So the first thing that stands out is that there's a lot of variation in labor productivity across sectors. The exact opposite of what this equation tells us here under these assumptions. Okay. So what could be the potential reasons for why there's so much variation? Also keep in mind for later that agriculture productivity in agriculture happens to be one of the lowest when compared with the other sectors in the economy. So what could
Ahmed,
be some of the potential reasons?
try and wrap up. You've been there an hour, so try and please.
Yes,
Short.
yes. So what are some of the potential reasons? So we look at wage gap. We say, okay, fine. Is it that there's imperfect labor mobility, which is resulting in variation in wage gap? When you look at this data, this is income reported by self-employed people in the labor force survey. This is not exact. I think if you have data on income, not by the self-employed, but by the workers in the labor force survey, you can come up with a better measure of wage gap. But nonetheless, here what you see is there's not as much of variation in wages as you see for production technology. As you see for labor productivity. Then this is the data which we get from an existing study, which gives us the technology parameter across different sectors. So we take the median value from here. And then what we are trying to work out is we are trying to work out the coefficient of variation, meaning how much of a variation there is in each of these measures. We see when you look at the productivity gap, the variation in productivity gap, the coefficient of variation is about 1.16. The coefficient of variation in wage gap is about 0.52. So wage gap on its own cannot explain or can only explain half of the variation in the productivity. When you adjust the wage gap for technology, you actually see that with accounting for differences in technology, meaning you need more capital or less capital in some sectors or the others, you actually see that you can actually explain almost all of the variation in the productivity gap. Okay. So this is actually good. This actually says that differences in technology and a bit of variation in wages is probably enough to explain what we observe, the variation we observe in productivity. Yeah. And we actually see that this variation in productivity has actually decreased over the period of time for Pakistan. So meaning, if you look at the overall economy as a whole, it doesn't seem to suggest that there's a lot of misallocation in the economy across sectors. Rather, this misallocation, it was there back in the 90s, but it has decreased by about 40% since then. It's still there, but not too bad. But what about the agriculture productivity gap when we only focus on the agri sector and the non-agri sector? So there's a lot of literature which looks at agri and non-agri and says, well, agri sector happens to be a lot less productive than the non-agri sector. And there's a lot of evidence which says that there's an over allocation of resources in the agri sector. Is it also the case for Pakistan? So we do find that that's indeed the case. So on the x-axis, the further away you are from one, that means that the productivity in the agriculture sector is much less than what it is for the rest of the economy. So lower it is, the worse, the higher, the bigger the agri gap is. And you can see for Pakistan, India, China, the agri gap or productivity in the agri sector is much lower than what it is in the rest of the economy. And this hasn't changed over the last 30 years. Unlike the variation in the productivity gap, which has decreased by about 40%, if you only focus on agri and non-agri, there's not much of a change in the case of Pakistan. So this agri gap has remained the same for the last 30 years. And this agri gap cannot be explained by differences in wages. It cannot be explained by differences in productivity, which leaves behind the only candidate, which is there must be government policies which lead to an over-allocation of resources in agriculture through support prices, fertilizer subsidies, import restrictions on, let's say, sugar and so on and so forth, which keeps on incentivizing production in agriculture sector more than what is considered efficient, right? It may also be due to market failures. For example, we know in the literature that frictions in the financial market affect the manufacturing sector more than the agri sector or the services sector. So those frictions may also be contributing to an over-allocation of resources in the agri sector. But the takeaway is, from the policy perspective, that we need to revisit policies which incentivize production in the agriculture sector beyond what is efficient in order for the transformation to take place. So I'll skip the trade openness and misallocation part, how trade openness can actually be useful in decreasing the extent of misallocation in the economy and how it can facilitate transformation. You can read the paper for that. So let me conclude with the final slide, what we have shown. So we show that an important reason for limited transformation observed in Pakistan is dismal growth in labor productivity. So, however, contrary to most countries, we find that the dismal growth in labor productivity is due to the decrease in capital output ratio, a trend we see going all the way back to 1970s. Furthermore, we also find evidence for significant misallocation of resources across the agri and the non-agri sectors of the economy. We find that this is not due to this cannot be explained due to frictions in labor mobility or due to differences in technology, but rather the most obvious candidate for this is either government policies or the kind of market failures which affect, let's say, the manufacturing sector a lot more than the agriculture sector, like friction in the financial market. And the key takeaway from this is that from this whole picture is that addressing macroeconomic uncertainty and revisiting policies which result in over-allocation of resources in the agri sector is key to transforming the economy. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Open to questions.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you very much. Good presentation. Let me quickly ask you one question before I go to the floor. Please, folks, raise your hands. You talk a lot about transformation, and it seems you have some optimal transformation in mind because you're saying it's a slow transformation. What is your expectation that you find this transformation is slow?
So I won't say I have an optimal goal in mind. So I don't have a goal in mind which says, let's say, the agri share should be 2% or 5% or 10%, right? So what I have in mind are two things. One is the transformation itself, which is a result of the development process. And then in that case, transformation itself is not attractive as a policy objective itself. What's attractive is the level of development, right? That's the productivity story, right? So you have very low productivity, which means less development, which means less transformation. From that perspective, you don't need to care about transformation. It will happen on its own. It's just a side story. It's an effect of everything else. Who cares? But then there's this misallocation story. If you do have the misallocation going on in the economy, if there is misallocation in the economy, then transformation does matter, because then facilitating transformation will lead to an increase in productivity in the economy, which will then further drive the transformation itself through the developmental channel, right? So the question over here is, one, why is structural transformation limited? For productivity reasons. And also, are there reasons which are preventing transformation from happening? And what are those reasons? And what are the policy what are the policy implications which are relevant for facilitating the transformation, for addressing those frictions, so transformation can take place and development can take place and we can keep on going ahead? So I don't have an end outcome in mind. It's more a question of, is the process a natural outcome of development, or are there frictions or policies or regulatory barriers which are preventing transformation in addition to development itself?
But you see, when you say things like facilitating transformation, it seems that there is some kind of a optimal transformation in mind. When you say things like misallocation, that there's some misallocation, again, this seems to be like you put in a utility framework, fine, but it seems to me that what you want much more is a societal optimal transformation, optimal allocation of resources in mind, because your story hangs together only when you draw from some position that is optimal, and therefore you're saying, no, this is not correct.
So this is what it will be, right? So what will be optimal is where the labor productivity gap is minimized, right? Or labor productivity is roughly similar across sectors. Right? Where is that achieved? That I don't know. But as long as there are significant differences in labor productivity, which cannot be explained by, let's say, frictions in labor mobility or technology, then you do need transformation in order to move closer to what is efficient. But the metric for what will be efficient will be determined by whether this condition is ultimately satisfied or not, or even if you allow for technology differences, whatever that equation looks like. So for example, in the case of agri gap here, so we do see that the productivity level in the agriculture sector is much lower than in the rest of the economy. It cannot be explained by differences in wages. It cannot be explained by differences in productivity. So clearly, there is room for transformation, meaning the current allocation is inefficient as per the theory which we have put forward. And we do need to facilitate transformation to move closer to the efficient allocation. How will we know that that is the efficient allocation? That will be when this wage gap, when this productivity gap is closed or minimized to the extent possible.
If I take what you're saying and go to the US and do an analysis across the sectors, I would find labor productivity to be vastly different. That's in the technology sector versus the agricultural sector. Then in that case, would your analysis still hold, or would it be different?
So this is what it will be, right? So let's go back to the equation here. So if you assume perfect competition, then this is what you have, right? So labor productivity can be intrinsically different across sectors because of differences in production technology, right? And due to differences in wages. But so it will definitely be different, and then obviously we allow for that over here, right? So if you allow for these productivity parameters or these technology parameters to be different, or human capital to be different across countries, you'll end up with different you'll end up with a different figure for productivity gaps for each of the country, and then that will be your benchmark. So for example, here, if you only look at the agri gap over here, for the agri gap for the US is very different than the agri gap for Pakistan. So clearly, with differences in those parameters, which are the determinant of labor productivity in the model, if those parameters are different in different economies, you'll end up with a different picture altogether. But generally speaking, having said that, it's a very clear it's a very consistent result in the literature that agri productivity ends up being less relative to the rest of the economy in almost all the countries which are out there. It's worse in the case of developing economies like we see here, but still agri productivity is still less even in the case of developed economies, which is again pointing to the over allocation in the agriculture sector. And we all know in Europe agriculture is heavily subsidized for all sorts of political economy reasons. In the US, it's heavily subsidized for all sorts of political economy reasons. And that political economy reasons, which is leading to over incentivization of agri production, is obviously what is explaining the productivity gap in the agri sector over here.
Okay, folks, time to move to the floor. Omar Sadiq, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It was indeed a very detailed presentation and work that you've done. It echoes what we have done at PIDE. We have done several studies on productivity, as you have mentioned in your paper as well. I have a couple of suggestions for you that in your report, you mentioned that in the PLA data set, the data is available only for a few years. So if you look at the Asian Productivity Organization's data set, you will find that they have a long time series of data that enables you to compare data over a long period of time. Secondly, you said that total factor productivity does not really explain labor productivity in Pakistan and most of the other countries. When I was working on productivity, I came across a study by Citibank, and they presented a stylized fact that in majority of the countries where total factor productivity was in excess of 3%, the growth rate there was consistently higher than 7%. And in the countries where TFP was below 3% or about 2%, the GDP growth was significantly lower. So there appears to be TFP, but at the end of the day, as we all know, that TFP is only a residual. So it is we have to be very cautious in interpreting the results. And you said that TFP in Pakistan and India, for example, is not very different. But if you look at the data post 2018, except for the COVID year, Pakistan's TFP has been declining, and India's and China's TFP are on the increase. You mentioned the reasons for capital output ratio. You also mentioned Sharpe ratio. So I think that it has something to do with, and by extension for capital intensity as well, capital labor ratio, that in Pakistan, investment has been very low. So investment obviously brings in new technology and capital. So that has something to do with low capital output and low capital labor ratios. So that's my understanding. And I just wanted to ask that in your report, you mentioned that low labor productivity is because of low labor force participation rate, especially female labor force participation rates. I'm a bit, I just want to understand that how is it so? Because given that output of Pakistan growth rate and investment rates, if labor force participation rate increases and if somehow sectors manage to employ more labor, wouldn't that translate into lower labor productivity, given the state of technology, given the capital intensity ratios and all that? So just your views. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you for that. So the first question which you had, the point which you had was around the data set which goes back. I'll have to ask you separately about which data set you're referring to, because the ones which I have, they go back to 1990s, and the PWT data set, it goes back even further to 60s. But maybe I can touch base with you separately and ask you what are the data set you have in mind for the TFP. Sure. For the TFP growth, I think, just to be clear, I do not say that TFP growth does not explain the variation in labor productivity in Pakistan. I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying all of the variation in TFP in labor productivity growth is explained by TFP growth because other factors are not contributing much at all, right? Whereas for the other economies, you see that TFP, these inputs play a very important role as well, right? On average, developing economies, the inputs explain about 33% of the variation in labor productivity for these countries. The other link, so whether TFP growth is greater than 3%, that will lead to a much higher growth rate in labor productivity or GDP. I don't know. I'll have to see the study to see the mechanism. What is the mechanism they have in mind over there when they are doing this kind of decomposition, that a low TFP growth rate will lead to a much higher increase in GDP. In the growth accounting exercise, obviously, it's a residual, as you said. So you account for the inputs and so on and so forth, and then you get the residual in the form of TFP growth, which doesn't appear to be very different from other economies. I mean, 2%, even if you take it to, let's say, 2% plus, doesn't really change the story as far as high growth needed to sustain or to achieve the kind of miracles which we saw for East Asia. But again, I mean, that city study, I don't know about that, but then I'll have to see the mechanism they have over there. For the labor force, I think either there's a typo in the paper or I've said something else. So over there, what I'm saying is, or what I wanted to say was, at the very least, that the reason why labor productivity, the level of labor productivity, not the growth, the level of labor productivity in Pakistan tends to be pretty decent when compared to India, and much higher than Bangladesh, and not too far from China either. So it's pretty decent, actually, when you look at the level of labor productivity in purchasing power parity terms. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that is, I mean, not a very sophisticated reason, but one of the reasons is obviously very low levels of labor force participation, meaning GDP, for the same level of GDP, you have much less people employed, and therefore you end up with a higher labor productivity number. And in that case, what you're saying is right. As you'll have more people join the labor force, productivity may end up, not the productivity, it depends. when you have more people joining in, are they joining in because of an increase in capital, meaning driven by wages and so on and so forth, in which case labor productivity will keep on increasing? Or are they joining in because some policies are incentivizing more and more people to enter the labor force, and therefore the denominator is increasing and the numerator is not increasing by that much? So as more people join the market, it could go either way. Labor productivity may increase or may decrease depending on why they are joining the market itself. So I don't have a clear answer over there. So you'll have to think, I mean, if you're thinking about female labor force participation, if you purely want to look at the effect of that on labor productivity, the first thing you'll have to ask is, okay, fine, what is causing them to join, right? And that is what will matter, I think, in the end. But maybe we should catch up on the sideline, or maybe in a different setting, and discuss some of the other things you're mentioning here. That will be good. And also discuss your paper as well, which I've gone through on productivity at PIDE.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have a very short question. Then that according to your very interesting research study, if we talk about human capital within development perspective, so how can one enhance human capital and boost labor productivity in the service sector by addressing disparities in training, education, and gender-based occupation? Thank you.
I think iske liye to be honest, like PIDE research has a much better answer than anything I can say here. So here what we do is we look more at the contribution of human capital and these inputs in driving, let's say, productivity in Pakistan. We don't consider per se what are the factors which are preventing, let's say, an increase in human capital, and therefore they may be relevant for increasing overall productivity. So we don't really look at that. But PIDE has definitely done a lot of work on both vocational under RASTA, which I'm a part of. So over there, we have definitely PIDE has funded studies which are looking at, let's say, vocational training, and more recently there are some studies on higher education, the performance of higher education itself as well. So I think there will be a better answer there compared to if I try to say something here which we haven't looked at in this study, I guess. So I'm not answering your question at all, to be honest. So sorry for that. But I'm definitely pointing you into a better direction.
Yes, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. My quick question is, and we have also talked about it, that do you see this variable as an exogenous to the system, or is it purely endogenous because the lack of capital investment and other necessary requirements, such as going to maybe product sophistication level, the trade volumes with the rest of the world, all variables are going to kind of create pressure inwards in terms of the system improvement. But a corollary question to this is that does it also help countries like Pakistan, maybe let's say in terms of industrial transfer from China to Pakistan, where essentially the costs are low because on the other side, the productivity is also low. So how long the countries can sustain such a situation, and eventually they have to improve to move out of this trap?
So I'll answer the trade question first. So I didn't go through it because I was sort of already taking a lot of the time. I think in the report we do talk about trade in quite some detail. The one thing which we actually show is that one is obviously Pakistan is a very closed economy. When you look at any measure, whether those are GVC participation measures or whether those are traditional trade openness measures, it's very close compared to what we have for everyone else. What we do show is that when you open up to trade, the misallocation which you have in the economy, both across the sectors, all the sectors, or whether you look at agri, non-agri decomposition, that misallocation decreases. So clearly, opening up to trade is useful for developing economies, including Pakistan, from the point of view of transformation. There's a lot of literature as well, which has actually come up only in the last 10 or 15 years, which also talks about how trade is important for the transformation process itself. It's actually interesting because it does not say it always leads to transformation. It rather also says if you happen to have a comparative advantage in agriculture, rather than, let's say, manufacturing or something else, opening up to trade may even prevent transformation, because the demand for agriculture will increase for your country, and therefore you'll remain stuck in agriculture for longer. But for many of the studies which have applied these frameworks to, let's say, Korea, Japan, other Southeast Asian economies, they actually go on to show that opening up to trade did indeed help in transforming the country in the way which I've defined here. So that's, I think, the trade part of the question over here. We also look at the effect of trade on TFP and what that means for growth. Again, that may very well be driven by the misallocation. As you decrease the misallocation in the economy by reducing frictions, whether those are trade frictions or whether those are domestic frictions, that decrease in misallocation increases overall productivity, which then obviously, which may then have implications for TFP growth as well. So that was that part. The exogenous endogenous part, I'll have to ask you again, like which variable do you have in mind when you say whether it's exogenous or endogenous?
Or
which...
you mentioned the investment in terms of the capital. To my mind always comes the standards, maybe ISO certifications and these sort of things, which essentially kind of improve the overall ambient environment in terms of how this production process actually takes place. And that also leads towards sophistication, some kind of improvement in terms of the productivity in others. So from that angle, I just wanted to know your point of view, that can it be managed from outside the system somehow by creating that kind of pushes?
I think so this is strictly my version of it, not necessarily my co-authors, because we don't really get into the details of this in the paper per se. So my version is a bit like this. So the declining trend we see in the case of Pakistan, it goes back to late 70s. It's not a new phenomenon. And for all this time period, when we are seeing this declining trend in capital to output ratio, it's not that we were, let's say, worse in terms of our governance systems or corruption or those kind of things vis-a-vis, let's say, Bangladesh or India or so on and so forth. For most of this time period, we were actually more developed than them across most of the measures which you can think about at the face value. So I'm a bit more skeptical towards that kind of story to explain this. What does stand out to me is the macro uncertainty story. The boom bust cycle and the way we have managed our macro policies and how that has generated the boom bust cycle and therefore amplified the risk for investment in Pakistan, that is in many ways special to Pakistan. Or most of the other countries don't, maybe some of them do come close to us, but then we stand out quite a bit over this whole time period. And that increase in risk, even though returns are pretty high, if you do the same analysis, the Sharpe ratio which I did, the real returns are pretty high. They are higher than what you have in India. So which actually shows you that you have less capital, so you'll naturally have higher marginal returns, and that's what you see in the stock market as well, over a medium-term frequency. But when you adjust for risk, then the story flips. Our returns are way more volatile. They end up being as high as 50 annual returns, as high as 50 on the index, on a 5-year index fund in some years, going all the way to 0 or maybe negative in other years. So the volatility is a lot. So it's that is where I probably incline when it comes to explaining what may be happening here. But again, like, there are other people who have focused more on the micro side of the stories, which is slightly closer or probably closer to what you have in mind in terms of these certifications, or let's say micro level frictions which are preventing investment from taking place, and those kind of things. They may be equally important as well. But I'm a bit more inclined on the macro uncertainty story, which is pretty special to Pakistan.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. Recently, Dr. Dole Nayab, he had a survey, it's called PIDE Basic Survey, which tells that around 62% of the youth, male particularly, they have desire to leave the country, right? They have desire to settle in another country. So in that perspective, what do you think how it will affect the gender-specific productivity and changes in the future labor market? Thank you.
I think on gender, probably I'm not the best person to answer this question, but I'm pretty sure, given the cultural context, the female participants or community members, it's difficult for them, or families are more reluctant to let them leave the country and go and find greener pastures. So clearly they'll be affected in a much more negative way than, let's say, the other gender, for sure, at the surface. But other than that, I mean, so people are leaving. I mean, it sort of makes sense, right, for why people are to leave. What is the incentive to work in the economy? You need to have higher wages, right? So that's why labor productivity is very important, or understanding labor productivity is very important, because labor productivity or wages are linked with labor productivity. So if labor productivity doesn't increase by much, wages are not going to increase by much. And if wages don't increase by much, it may be that you are better off going abroad and working there, even if it comes at a social cost, or let's say you lose your social networks and all that. And in that case, again, like if you, so from policy perspective, then it's important, okay, fine, labor productivity is not increasing by much, then it's important to know why it's not increasing by much. And it's an important policy question. Is it really TFP growth, or is it capital, or is it something else? It's a very important policy question. If you think it's a TFP growth story, then the kind of policy interventions you need are very different. You're talking about expanding the frontier outputs, right? You're talking about new knowledge. You're talking about new ways of doing things, managerial or scientific. You're talking about R&D investment. You're talking about things which push the frontier out, and that then grows the economy. The kind of policies that will do that, they are very different. But if you believe, or if you're more towards the story where you say that the labor productivity is not increasing because capital output ratio is decreasing, which is related to investment. I think one of the members over here did mention investment, and I forgot about that. So capital is directly linked with investment, even though I didn't take the name of investment per se, but it's essentially directly linked over here. So if you believe that capital is falling and capital is the story, then your policy prescription is not about pushing the frontier out through R&D, through knowledge creation, through better managerial techniques, and so on and so forth. But then your policy should be about, are there any frictions which are preventing capital accumulation, like a lot of the work done by PIDE? Or is it a lot to do more with, let's say, the macro uncertainty which the businesses face when they have to operate in Pakistan? Is it more to do with that? Or it could also be, you may say, well, it could also be the scale. The market is very small and you don't let people invest. Let's say once they come in, it's not very easy to, let's say, operate in multiple markets. And maybe that prevents businesses from entering the Pakistani market, because the Pakistani market by construction is very small in terms of purchasing power. So then the discussion becomes very different. So, I mean, at the end of the day, to wrap it up, the gender side, I think at the face of it is very obvious. But then again, I'm not the best person to say anything about that. But on the policy side, I think it's very important to have some sense, or take a stand on which of these, the TFP growth or the capital accumulation story, which of these is more important. And then the policy prescriptions will be very different quite different under the two scenarios. I'm not saying that it's only this or that, it may be both, but you have to think about that more carefully.
Thank you, Ahmed. A great seminar, good seminar. Please tell your Pakistani snobs in England.
I will.
And the US, that they're not the custodians of knowledge. This business that, I'm very surprised, this business that Pakistanis in England and America think that they know about Pakistan, I think they have to wake up and apologize. They don't know anything about Pakistan. So tell them to be humble and join us in a national dialogue where we can all participate. Call us to your forum, we'll speak to you. You guys don't even want to acknowledge that Pakistani academics exist. This kind of snobbery is amazing. And then you guys talk about elite capture. I find Pakistani economists are the worst hypocrites that I've come across, because they cannot talk to each other. They hide in silos. They can't share the research. They backbite. They don't want to come and present their work, or they don't want to come and listen to others' work being presented. The day we develop this dialogue, maybe this country will change. So thank you, Ahmed. Enjoyed your work. We will
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor always.
To continue to engage with you. All the best.
Thank you very much.